should we then always just go for the gold? And I have what I call the plumber problem to maybe give us some second thoughts on that, because customers aren't actually always shopping for value, or rather it's not, maybe they are shopping for value, but it's actually not always what they're willing to pay for. And I'm going to illustrate that with a little story. So imagine that something breaks in your home, like a sink. You call the plumber arrives. He says, oh, it's lucky I could find a parking place right where you live. So he then, just before he walks into your apartment or your place, he says, oh, well, I see you have nice floors or carpets. I'm just going to take my shoes off. So he takes his shoes off, then walks in, fixes your sink, leaves, and sends you an invoice. The invoice has 3 line items on it. So let's say that value is sort of one perspective that you can put on these line items, and expectation to pay is another. So we're just going to slide it in here. So first, he charges you, let's say, 250 euros for time and material. So he replaced your sink. He was there for an hour, 250 euros. You have demand for that. It's valuable to you. You called him to say, please come spend an hour and bring me a new sink. You were also expecting to pay for it. It's like, it would have been weird if he hadn't charged you for that. Then comes another line item. Parking fee, €8.72. Do you have demand for that? Not really. But you have a high degree of expectation to pay for it because you realize immediately that he paid €8.72 to park in front of your place, to go up and spend the time and materials to actually solve your problem. So with this quadrant, high expectation to pay, low value, we often see that, well, there is actually a high willingness to pay. That doesn't mean that they have demand for it. It's not what they're searching for to buy from you, but they will pay it. And let's give the last example, shoe fee. So the plumber decides that he surveyed all the customers, and all the customers on a 1 to 5 ranking said, I definitely give it 5 stars that the plumber is mindful of my home, cleans up after himself, and takes his shoes off. So the plumber decided, well, I'm just gonna invent this service where I take off my shoes before I walk into an apartment, and then because everybody seems to demand that and see high value in it, I'm just gonna charge $10 euros for it. Would you pay that fee? Maybe you would, because the time isn't worth it to argue it, but you'd feel that it was unfair. You have demand for it. If you were asked, would you rather that the plumber took off his shoes? You'd definitely say, yes, that is a very good service. I appreciate the consideration. I'd like him to do it. So there is demand, but the expectation to pay is very low because you have no sense of the cost that was involved. It was free for him to do. You felt that it was implied in the relationship that you had. You've never been charged a shoe fee before, and you feel that it's odd. So all these things combine to having a very low expectation to pay. And if you want a different term for it, just substitute expectation to pay with fairness. You feel that it's unfair to charge you for this. So let's, instead of the plumber example, actually move over to these AI model metrics that we had. So if we use the 2021 metrics, users, gigabytes processed, data outputs, and deployed AI models, we see that even though data outputs is at the very end of the value chain, maybe we'll see, because of the way that these outputs are produced, it's their data, it's their models. They came up with the ideas for the models. They actually structured the models and maintained them and so on and so forth. They even did the deployment. Maybe the customer will feel that if you charge them based on number of credit scores produced or something similar, that you weren't enough of a causal effect in producing those outputs to make it fair that you're charging based on that. So there you revert to something like deployed AI models where you definitely have a good case and then you settle for that. So yes, the gold is at the end of the rainbow value chain, except that you need to check for fairness. You need to check for fairness. So how do we use this in B2B? Wallet structure. So wallet structuring is where we take these metrics and we take our idea of what we're serving to a particular customer, and we then understand what's going on in the purchasing process and then use our pricing model to prepare for that. Let's do 2021 AI again. They have this set up. What we can see is that if we have these sort of 4 metrics that we just showed in the slide before, they're actually going to go through a number of decision makers in trying to get this platform into a new bank. So obviously they will have some sort of business line that is deciding that AI is now a priority for the bank. But they will also have to talk to the CIO, who likely is going to support the installation of the software and so on. Maybe there's compliance and procurement and other stakeholders involved in this sort of, I call it purchasing by committee. Usually it's the business line that has the demand, but everyone else has to give sort of a green light for the software to actually be bought. So I say that you need to, it's like a padlock. You need to have all the numbers correct in the combination for it to unlock. 3 out of 4 isn't good enough, right? So if we look at this sort of purchasing committee as sort of a whole, what we'll realize a few things. One thing we'll realize is that they actually, we'll skip that. They actually don't view all these metrics the same way. So the line of business might view it as we just saw it, but the CIO might view it completely differently. He might say, well, I actually see data outputs as not that valuable, but maybe I have a higher degree of expectation to pay for them because they are sort of an infrastructure element, and surely there are costs associated with that. Maybe he has a very high expectation to pay for gigabytes processed because he knows how expensive they are, so fair enough, but maybe they're not as valuable, or maybe they're even more valuable as well. So, and we can see this for other stakeholders in the organization as well. What we'll see is that the primary value metric, the one that you're trying to sell to your main customer, should be picked from this segment. I call this main desk pricing items. So if you're selling to an insurance company, head of claims, then price per claim probably is a good metric. But then when you walk over to a CIO, then you should probably do something else, more like data outputs, users, gigabytes processed, or something like that, because that's what the CIO wants to pay for. So he's more expectation to pay and fairness oriented, where your main desk is more value oriented. So we go back to sort of this case that I showed before, where with this mock-up of an AI platform for banks and insurance companies, the way that it's structured with cores and production and development engines and live modules and so on and so forth, is actually to give the enterprise SaaS provider a template to negotiate and sell into the organizations that they're trying to sell to in the following way. The top goes to the CIO because he's actually the main customer here. So he has expectation to pay for infrastructure. But then the value is sold to the business line. So he gets all the modules and all the data outputs and so on, while the CIO pays the infrastructure and the engines and the cores. And then we know that if we don't provide sort of an open source solution, procurement won't play. So we then decide that that's also okay. It's non-binding. They can pull in third-party solutions as well. So I usually say that a good pricing model works as a conversation manual for your customer. So you go in, you demo the product, you leave your pricing on the table and leave. And once you leave, then the stakeholders that sit together on the table and try to figure out what you're charging them should be able to look at your model and say, well, okay, I see these line items over here, gigabytes and API calls. Surely they're tech infrastructure, so you should pay for those. But these over here, which are users and what have you, that are more tied to the core output of the value creation, maybe they should go to the business line and so on. So the key takeaway is each of these stakeholders usually has a budget. And if you're able to tap each of these budgets, then you're actually able to increase your price and actually also defend it better in your negotiations. So I've been able to raise prices 30-40% on 1 million euros plus deals by just going in and also pricing some of the other silos, because the pricing that had been done beforehand was just to the main business line. And then we just went in and said, well, we have all this infrastructure and compliance and all these other things that we also need to have paid for, and they surely are parking fees, they're costs that we have. Please lift the costs away from us. And the customers just lifted the costs away. So, this was the crash course, and it's a lot to take in. I'm hoping that we're going to have a little bit of time for questions now. But just to reiterate, the main items are: make sure that you know if you're serving one or more markets, if you're serving more than one, fence. Then in each fence, build packaging around jobs to be done, things you're actually solving for the customer. It's much easier for you. Then work with pricing metrics. Figure out which ones are value and which ones are fairness oriented, and then build it into your model so that your enterprise customer knows which budget pays for what.